At 9:47 a.m. on July 12, 1943, Senior Sergeant Nikolai Sherstnev watched smoke rise from the barrel of his ZiS-3 76mm divisional gun, positioned on a low ridge overlooking the approaches to Prokhorovka in southern Russia. The barrel was glowing dull red along its entire length, visible despite the bright morning sunlight. Sherstnev's gun crew had been firing continuously for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Averaging one round every 48 seconds, far exceeding the weapon's designed sustained rate of fire. The gun's manual specified maximum sustained rate of 8 rounds per minute for short periods, with cooling intervals required after every 20 rounds. Sherstnev's crew had fired 537 rounds without pause, and the barrel temperature had exceeded 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to ignite the paint and begin degrading the barrel steel itself. Before him, across 1,200 meters of open ground, approximately 380 German tanks of the 2 SS Panzer Corps advanced towards Soviet positions in the largest armored engagement in history. The tanks were Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer ZiS-3, supported by infantry and self-propelled guns, attacking in waves designed to overwhelm Soviet defenses through sheer mass and firepower. Standard Soviet doctrine said, retreat when facing such overwhelming force, preserving artillery for defense at successive fallback positions. But Sherstnev's battery commander, Captain Ivan Igishev, had ordered them to hold position and fire until ammunition was exhausted, guns destroyed, or crew killed. 6 guns against 380 tanks. Mathematics said the artillery would be overrun within minutes. Physics said the gun barrels would fail long before ammunition ran out. At 1:53 p.m., after 6 hours and 23 minutes of continuous firing, Sherstnev's gun barrel split along a 12-inch crack near the breech, venting propellant gases sideways and rendering the weapon inoperable. The barrel had fired 892 rounds, nearly 300 times its designed combat load before maintenance. The steel had failed from thermal stress, metallurgical changes from sustained heat exposure, and mechanical fatigue from repeated firing shocks. The gun was dead, its barrel destroyed not by enemy fire, but by its own sustained violence. Around him, 4 of the battery's 6 guns had similarly failed, their barrels cracked, warped, or completely melted. Only 1 gun remained operational, firing its final rounds as German tanks closed to within 400 meters. When the engagement ended at 2:17 p.m., Igishev's battery had fired 3,247 rounds in 6 hours and 37 minutes, destroyed or damaged 87 German tanks, and delayed the German advance long enough for Soviet reinforcements to arrive and establish new defensive lines. Of the battery's 42 crew members, 34 were dead, killed by German counter-battery fire, tank guns, or infantry attacks on their positions. The 5 destroyed guns sat silent, their melted barrels testament to the most intense artillery. Engagement of the war, the moment when Soviet gunners fired until physics itself said, stop. If you want to see how 6 artillery pieces fired 3,200 shells until their barrels melted and stopped 380 German tanks, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories where desperation pushed equipment beyond all limits. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the 6-hour battle where Soviet gunners literally destroyed their own weapons by firing them. Back to July 5, 1943, and the beginning of the largest tank battle in history. The Battle of Kursk began on July 5, 1943, when German forces launched Operation Citadel, a massive offensive designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, a bulge in the front lines extending westward into German-held territory. The Germans committed approximately 780,000 troops, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 2,050 aircraft to the operation, making it one of the largest offensive operations of the war. The southern pincer of the attack, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, included the Elites II SS Panzer Corps with 3 armored divisions, Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. These divisions were equipped with the newest German armor, including Tiger the Ferns, heavy tanks and Panther medium tanks, considered superior to most Soviet armor. Soviet intelligence had determined the German offensive's timing and objectives months in advance through a combination of signals, intelligence, interrogation of captured Germans, and information from espionage networks. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov convinced Stalin to adopt a defensive strategy rather than launching preemptive attacks. The Soviets would allow Germans to attack into heavily fortified defensive zones, absorbing the offensive's momentum, then counterattack when German forces were exhausted. This strategy required Soviet forces to hold defensive positions against overwhelming German attacks, accepting heavy casualties, to bleed German strength. The defensive zone around Kursk consisted of 8 successive defensive lines extending up to 200 kilometers in depth. Each line included anti-tank ditches, minefields, infantry trenches, artillery positions, and tank reserves. The Soviets concentrated approximately 1,300,000 troops, 3,600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 2,650 aircraft in the Kursk salient, creating the most heavily defended position in military history. The strategy depended on artillery and anti-tank guns destroying German armor before tanks could break through defensive lines. Captain Ivan Igishev commanded the 2nd Battery, 322nd Guards Artillery Regiment, positioned on a low ridge approximately 8 kilometers southwest of Prokhorovka. His battery consisted of 6 ZiS-3 76mm divisional guns, the standard Soviet field artillery piece, with 7-man crews per gun totaling 42 personnel. The ZiS-3 was a versatile weapon, effective against infantry, fortifications, and light to medium. Armor. Technical specifications: caliber 76.2 mm, barrel length 3.24 meters, weight 116 kilograms in firing position, maximum range 13,290 meters against area targets, effective anti-tank range approximately 1,500 meters, rate of fire 25 rounds per minute maximum for short bursts, 8 to 10 rounds sustained. The gun used fixed ammunition with the projectile and propellant charge combined in a single brass cartridge weighing approximately 9.5 kilograms. High explosive fragmentation rounds were used against infantry and soft targets. Armor-piercing rounds used against tanks could penetrate 70 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters range at 0 degrees angle of impact, sufficient to destroy Panzer IV medium tanks and damage heavier armor at close range. Each gun was supplied with approximately 150 rounds in ready storage near the gun position, with additional ammunition stored 500 meters behind the lines, requiring resupply by truck or manual carry. Igishev's battery was positioned to cover approaches to Prokhorovka from the southwest, the expected axis of German attack if 2 SS Panzer Corps broke through initial defensive lines. The position offered good fields of fire across approximately 2 kilometers of relatively open ground, with limited cover for attacking armor. The guns were dug into earthen revetments, providing protection from artillery fragments, but not from direct tank fire. Soviet defensive doctrine assumed artillery positions would be overrun if German tanks reached them. So positions emphasized concealment and fields of fire rather than survivability. By July 11, 1943, German forces had penetrated the first 2 Soviet defensive lines and were approaching the critical Prokhorovka area. Soviet command recognized that loss of Prokhorovka would allow Germans to exploit toward Kursk from the south, potentially encircling large Soviet forces. Additional Soviet armor was ordered to Prokhorovka for a counterattack scheduled for July 12th, but German reconnaissance identified the Soviet armor concentration, and 2 SS Panzer Corps planned a preemptive attack to destroy Soviet tanks before they could organize their counterattack. At 4 a.m. on July 12th, Igishev received orders from regimental command. German armor attack expected at dawn. Battery to hold position and engage at maximum rate regardless of ammunition, expenditure, or equipment damage. Hold until ordered to withdraw, or until position overrun. No withdrawal order would be given unless battery position became untenable. The order was clear: fire everything, destroy as many tanks as possible, except that position would likely be lost, and crews killed or captured. Igishev briefed his gun commanders at 4:30 a.m. He explained the tactical situation. Approximately 300 to 400 German tanks would attack through their sector, beginning at approximately 5:30 a.m. Soviet armor would counterattack at 8:30 a.m. Battery must delay German advance for 3 hours minimum to allow Soviet counterattack to develop. He emphasized maximum rate of fire. Fire as fast as you can load. Don't worry about barrel overheating. Don't worry about ammunition conservation. Our job is to kill tanks. If we run out of ammunition, we failed. If the guns break from overheating, we succeeded. At 5:03 a.m., the first German tanks appeared, approximately 4,000 meters distant, visible as dark shapes in the pre-dawn twilight. Igishev ordered crews to prepare for engagement, but hold fire until range decreased to 1,500 meters, where armor-piercing rounds would be most effective. The tension during the next 20 minutes was severe, watching the massive German formation approach while unable to fire. Gun crews loaded armor-piercing rounds, adjusted sights for 1,500-meter range, and waited. At 5:23 a.m., with German tanks at 1,500 meters and closing, Igishev ordered, "Battery, commence firing." All 6 guns fired within 3 seconds, 6 armor-piercing rounds streaking toward the German formation. The first volley achieved 2 hits, one destroying a Panzer C4 with penetration through the side armor, one damaging a Panther's track. The guns reloaded and fired again, establishing a rhythm that would continue for the next 6 hours. The ZiS-3's loading procedure required coordinated action by the 7-man crew. The gun commander selected targets and gave fire commands. The gunner aimed the weapon using the telescopic sight, adjusting for range and lead. The loader extracted the spent cartridge case from the breech, placed it in a disposal pit, retrieved a fresh round from the ready rack, and loaded it into the breech. The breech operator closed the breech and ensured it locked properly. The firer pulled the firing lanyard when commanded. 2 ammunition handlers retrieved rounds from storage and kept the ready rack stocked. 1 crew member operated the gun's traversing mechanism to shift aim between targets. At maximum rate of fire, this procedure took approximately 2.4 seconds per round, allowing 25 rounds per minute. But sustained fire at this rate was impossible because the barrel overheated rapidly. Ammunition handlers couldn't maintain the pace, and crew fatigue degraded performance. Standard doctrine called for burst fire, 5 to 10 rounds rapid fire, pause to allow barrel cooling and crew rest, resume firing. Igishev's orders eliminated the pause. Crews were to maintain maximum fire rate until ammunition exhausted or guns failed. Between 5:23 a.m. and 6 a.m., the battery fired 892 rounds, averaging 148 rounds per gun, approximately 6 rounds per minute sustained. This rate, though below theoretical maximum, far exceeded normal combat firing rates and generated barrel temperatures approaching 600 degrees Celsius. Crews began noticing barrel heat effects, paint burning off the barrel exterior, visible heat shimmer above the barrel, the sharp metallic smell of overheating steel. The gun commanders reported these observations to Igishev, who ordered, "Continue firing. The barrels will hold or they won't. We can't stop." German casualties during this first phase were significant. The concentrated fire from 6 guns, though individually inaccurate, created a beaten zone of impacts across the German formation's front. Of the 892 rounds fired, approximately 47 achieved hits on German armor, destroying 14 tanks and damaging 19 more. German advance in the battery's sector slowed as tank commanders maneuvered to avoid the artillery fire, creating bunching and confusion that multiplied the artillery's effectiveness. But German counter-battery fire began at 5:47 a.m. German artillery observers identified the Soviet gun positions from muzzle flashes and directed artillery fire onto the ridge. High explosive shells began impacting around the gun positions, showering crews with fragments and forcing them to work under continuous bombardment. At 6:12 a.m., a German 150mm shell scored a direct hit on Gunzer 4, destroying the weapon and killing its entire 7-man crew instantly. The other 5 guns continued firing. Between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m., the battery fired another 847 rounds from the 5 remaining guns, averaging 169 rounds per gun. Barrel temperatures exceeded 700 degrees Celsius. The gun's recoil mechanisms, designed to absorb firing shock and return the barrel to battery position, began showing signs of overheating in the hydraulic fluid. Recoil became less consistent, with some shots leaving the barrel significantly out of position, requiring manual realignment. Ammunition handlers were exhausted from the physical effort of carrying 9.5 kilogram rounds continuously for 90 minutes. Several handlers collapsed from heat exhaustion and were replaced by infantry soldiers from nearby positions. During this hour, the battery destroyed 11 additional German tanks and damaged 16 more. But German infantry began infiltrating toward the battery position, using terrain folds and shell craters for cover. At 6:43 a.m., German infantry reached within 200 meters of gun number 2's position. The gun crew engaged the infantry with their personal weapons and hand grenades while continuing to load and fire the main gun against tanks. The crew commander, Sergeant Viktor Ponomarev, was killed by German rifle fire at 6:51 a.m., but the crew continued operating the gun under the loader's direction. At 7:15 a.m., ammunition resupply became critical. The battery had fired 1,739 rounds, exhausting the ready ammunition. At each gun position, where approximately 150 rounds per gun had been stored. Trucks carrying additional ammunition from regimental stores 15 kilometers behind the lines were attempting to reach the battery position, but German artillery observers had identified the supply route and were interdicting it with concentrated fire. The trucks could approach no closer than 800 meters behind the ridge without being destroyed. Igishev organized a manual resupply chain, perhaps the most desperate improvisation of the WW2 engagement. Infantry soldiers from the 32nd Guards Rifle Regiment, positioned in trenches 300 meters behind the artillery, were pulled from their positions. Artillery crew members not actively serving guns, the wounded, the exhausted, anyone who could walk, were organized into the chain. Men formed a human conveyor belt. One group at the trucks loading ammunition into makeshift carriers, another group running the ammunition forward through German artillery fire, a third group at the gun positions distributing rounds to the gun crews. Each man carried 2 rounds, one under each arm, 19 kilograms total. The route was 800 meters of broken ground under continuous German artillery bombardment. A runner could cover the distance in approximately 4 minutes running, deliver the rounds, and return in another 4 minutes, completing one circuit every 8 minutes. With approximately 40 men in the chain at any given time, the system could theoretically deliver 300 rounds per hour to the gun positions, barely adequate to sustain firing at reduced rates. But the casualties were horrific. German artillery fire caught men in the open, killing them instantly, or wounding them so severely they couldn't continue. Private Alexei Morozov, age 19, was hit by shell fragments on his 3rd trip, severing his left arm at the elbow. He completed the delivery with his remaining arm, handed off the 2 rounds, and collapsed. He bled to death before medics could reach him. Sergeant Pavel Kuznetsov was killed by a direct hit on his 6th trip, his body and the 2 rounds he carried disintegrating in the explosion. The men knew the statistics. Of the approximately 60 men who participated in the ammunition chain between 7:15 a.m. and 9 a.m., 23 were killed and 17 wounded, a 67% casualty rate for delivering ammunition. Yet men continued volunteering when replacements were needed, understanding that stopping meant the guns would fall silent and the German tanks would break through. Private Ivan Golovanov made 11 successful trips, delivering 22 rounds before being killed on his 12th trip by shell fragments that struck him in the back. He died still holding the 2 rounds he was carrying. The psychological strain on the men running ammunition was perhaps worse than the physical danger. They could see German tanks advancing, hear the artillery explosions around them, watch their comrades being killed, and know that each trip increased their probability of death. Several men broke psychologically, freezing in shell holes unable to move. Commissars would pull them out, sometimes offering encouragement, sometimes threatening to shoot them for cowardice, usually just dragging them back to continue. One man, whose name was not recorded, ran forward with his 2 rounds, delivered them, then walked calmly away from the battlefield and was never seen again. No one tried to stop him. This resupply operation, costly as it was, delivered approximately 1,200 Additional rounds to the gun positions between 7:15 a.m. and 9:00 a.m., allowing the guns to continue firing when ammunition exhaustion would otherwise have silenced them. The 23 men killed carrying ammunition died to deliver rounds that destroyed perhaps 15 German tanks, a brutal calculus but one that made tactical sense in the context of Kursk, where stopping the German offensive required accepting terrible casualties. Between 7:00 a.m. and 8:00 a.m., the battery fired 16 rounds from 5 guns, averaging 122 rounds per gun. Fire rate was declining as crew fatigue, casualties, and mechanical issues slowed operations. Barrel temperatures now exceeded 750 degrees Celsius. Gun number 5's barrel began showing visible warping, the barrel drooping slightly from thermal deformation. The gun commander reported this to Igishev, who ordered, "Elevate the barrel 2 degrees to compensate and continue firing." During this hour, an additional 13 German tanks were destroyed and 12 damaged. The cumulative effect of the sustained artillery fire was forcing German commanders to commit additional forces to suppress or destroy the Soviet battery. German tank destroyers and assault guns began engaging the battery positions with direct fire. At 7:37 a.m., a Panzer IV scored a direct hit on gun number 6, destroying the weapon and killing 4 crew members. 3 survived with wounds. 4 guns remained operational. At 8 a.m., Igishev received radio communication that Soviet armor counterattack had begun, but was delayed by German resistance and would not reach his sector until approximately 10 a.m. The battery would need to hold for 2 more hours rather than the originally planned 30 minutes. Igishev informed his gun commanders, 2 more hours, keep firing. Between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m., the 4 remaining guns fired 496 rounds, averaging 124 rounds per gun. Barrel heat was now creating significant accuracy problems. The extreme temperature caused the barrel steel to expand unevenly, changing the barrel's internal dimensions and degrading accuracy. Shots that should have landed at 1,000 meters were impacting 50 to 100 meters short or over. Gun crews compensated by aiming slightly high or low based on observation of impacts, but precision was degrading rapidly. Gun number 3's barrel split at 8:34 a.m., a 6-inch crack appearing near the muzzle. The gun continued firing for 3 more rounds before the crack widened and vented propellant gases forward, creating a dangerous condition. The crew abandoned gun number 3, taking cover in a nearby trench. 3 guns remained operational. Between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., the 3 surviving guns fired 392 rounds, averaging 130 rounds per gun. The crews were operating on pure determination, physically exhausted beyond normal human endurance. Several crew members were wounded, but continued serving their guns. Ammunition handlers were collapsing after delivering rounds, lying in the gun pits gasping for air, then forcing themselves up to carry more ammunition. The guns themselves were dying. Gun number 1's recoil mechanism failed completely at 9:23 a.m., the hydraulic fluid having boiled away from sustained heat. The gun could no longer return to battery position after firing, requiring the crew to manually push the 1-ton weapon back into position after each shot. This reduced fire rate to approximately 2 rounds per minute, but the crew continued. At 9:47 a.m., Scherstnev's gun, the number 2 barrel temperature reached critical levels, the barrel glowing visibly red and smoke rising from the paint and steel oxidation. Metallurgical changes in the steel from sustained heat exposure were weakening the barrel structure. Each successive shot increased the probability of catastrophic failure. Between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m., the 3 guns fired 284 rounds. Gun number 1, operating manually without recoil mechanism, managed only 37 rounds during this hour. Gun number 2 and gun number 5 maintained approximately 120 rounds per hour each, despite severe overheating. At 10:17 a.m., Soviet armor elements reached the engagement area, T-34 tanks engaging German forces and drawing attention away from the artillery battery. But German forces were close enough to the battery position that the guns continued firing in direct support of the Soviet tank attack. The engagement evolved into a close-range melee with tanks, infantry, and artillery fighting within visual range. Gun number 5's barrel failed at 10:43 a.m., the barrel warping so severely that the last round fired tumbled in flight and impacted only 300 meters from the gun. The crew ceased firing. 2 guns remained operational, gun number 1 operating manually at reduced rate, and gun number 2 operating despite critical barrel overheating. Between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m., the 2 surviving guns fired 187 rounds, gun number 1 contributing 42 rounds, gun number 2 firing 145 rounds. Gun number 2's crew, commanded by Shirstnev, refused to acknowledge barrel failure warnings and maintained fire rate despite visible barrel deformation and dangerous heat levels. At 12:34 p.m., German artillery achieved a direct hit on gun number 1, destroying the weapon and killing the remaining crew. Only gun number 2 remained operational. Between 12:00 p.m. and 1 p.m., gun number 2 fired 156 rounds, Shirstnev's crew operating in a state of exhausted delirium, loading and firing mechanically without conscious thought. The barrel was cherry red along its entire length, the metal visibly softening. At 1:53 p.m., after 6 hours and 23 minutes of continuous firing, gun number 2's barrel split catastrophically. A 12-inch crack appeared near the breech, venting propellant gases sideways. The gun had fired its 892nd round. The barrel was dead, destroyed by its own sustained violence. Shirstnev ordered his crew to abandon the gun and take cover. They had fired until the gun died, exactly as ordered. Around them, the battlefield was still chaotic with Soviet and German armor engaged at close range. But the artillery mission was complete. The 6 guns had delayed the German advance long enough for Soviet reinforcements to arrive and establish defensive positions that would ultimately stop the German offensive. When the engagement area was secured by Soviet forces on July 13th, investigators from the main artillery directorate examined the destroyed guns to understand the barrel failures. 5 of 6 guns showed barrel failure from thermal stress rather than enemy fire. Gun number 1's barrel, though destroyed by a direct German artillery hit, showed advanced thermal damage that would have caused failure within additional firing. Guns number 2, the 3, the 5, and the 6 had barrels that had cracked, warped, or partially melted from sustained firing beyond design limits. Metallurgical analysis of the failed barrels, conducted at the Kirov Metallurgical Institute in Leningrad, revealed the specific failure mechanisms. Steel samples cut from the failed barrels showed that metal temperatures had exceeded 850 degrees Celsius. During sustained firing, far above the normal operating temperature of approximately 300 to 400 degrees Celsius during designed firing schedules. At these extreme temperatures, the barrel steel underwent several destructive metallurgical changes. First, thermal expansion caused the barrel's internal dimensions to increase significantly. The barrel steel expanded approximately 0.8% at 850 degrees, meaning a 76 mm bore expanded to approximately 76.6 mm. This increased diameter reduced the propellant gas seal around the projectile, decreasing muzzle velocity and accuracy. More critically, uneven heating caused differential expansion, with the barrel's bore expanding more than the exterior, creating internal stresses. Second, prolonged exposure to temperatures above 700 degrees caused grain boundary weakening in the steel's crystalline structure. Steel consists of microscopic crystalline grains, and the strength depends partly on the bonds between these grains. High temperature causes these grain boundaries to weaken through a process called stress corrosion, where mechanical stress and temperature combine to progressively damage the crystal structure. The failed barrels showed extensive grain boundary cracking under microscopic examination. Third, repeated firing shocks created mechanical fatigue in steel already weakened by thermal stress. Each shot subjected the barrel to enormous mechanical stress as propellant gases at 3,000 atmospheres pressure accelerated the projectile down the bore. Normal barrel steel can withstand thousands of these firing cycles, but thermally weakened steel failed after hundreds of cycles. Cracks propagating from grain boundaries until the barrel structure could no longer contain the propellant pressure. The specific failure modes varied. Gun number 2's barrel split longitudinally near the breech, a 12-inch crack that vented propellant gases sideways. Gun number 3's barrel cracks circumferentially near the muzzle, weakening the barrel. Structure until it's separated during recoil. Gun number 5's barrel warped from uneven heating, sagging visibly and causing projectiles to tumble. Gun number 6's barrel showed multiple small cracks near the forcing cone, the area where the projectile enters the rifling. All failures resulted from thermal stress exceeding the steel's structural limits. The battery's tactical achievement was quantified by battlefield assessment teams. German tank wrecks in the battery's sector totaled 87 confirmed kills or mobility kills, including 12 Tiger-Bind heavy tanks, 19 Panther medium tanks, 37 Panzer medium tanks, and 19 Stuggy third assault guns. The battery's 3,247 rounds fired represented approximately 3.7% hit rate, typical for artillery and direct fire anti-tank role. The 87 tanks destroyed represented approximately 22% of the German armor attacking through that sector, a tactically significant attrition. The human cost was severe. Of the battery's original 42 crew members, 34 were killed during the engagement. The 8 survivors were all wounded, 5 seriously. Captain Igishev survived with shrapnel wounds and burns. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the nation's highest military decoration, for his leadership during the engagement. Surviving crew members received Orders of the Red Banner, or Orders of Glory. The engagement became legendary in Soviet artillery training, studied as an example of maximum effort under impossible circumstances. Artillery manuals added sections on sustained high-rate fire and barrel thermal management, acknowledging that desperate tactical situations might require firing beyond equipment design limits. The manuals noted that ZiS-3 guns could sustain approximately 800 to 900 rounds before barrel failure if fired continuously, establishing an upper limit for emergency situations. Post-war German accounts of the Prokhorovka engagement acknowledged the effectiveness of Soviet artillery in disrupting the attack. German unit. Reports noted that concentrated artillery fire from concealed positions caused heavy casualties and forced tactical adjustments that delayed the advance. One report from Leibstandarte Division noted, "Advance was impeded by exceptionally heavy and accurate anti-tank gunfire from a ridge position southwest of objective. Multiple attempts to suppress the position with artillery and direct tank fire were unsuccessful. Position continued firing for several hours despite being under continuous bombardment. Estimated 70 to 90 tank hits were achieved by this position before it was finally silenced." The broader Battle of Kursk ended in German defeat, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Soviet defensive tactics, including the stubborn artillery defense exemplified by Igishev's battery, imposed sufficient casualties and delays to exhaust German offensive capability. After Kursk, initiative on the Eastern Front shifted permanently to the Soviets. The melted barrel of gun number 2 was recovered and sent to a museum in Moscow, displayed as evidence of Soviet determination and sacrifice. The barrel, cracked and warped, showed the physical cost of the 6-hour engagement. Technical examination confirmed that barrel steel had reached temperatures exceeding 850 degrees Celsius, well above normal operating temperatures, and sufficient to cause permanent metallurgical damage. July 12, 1943 was when 6 Soviet guns fired 3,247 rounds in 6 hours against 380 German tanks. 5:23 a.m. was when firing began. 1:53 p.m. was when the last gun barrel split from sustained heat. 6 hours and 30 minutes of continuous firing, averaging 1 round every 7 seconds across all guns. 892 rounds was the maximum fired by a single gun before barrel failure. 87 German tanks destroyed was the achievement. 34 of 42 crew members killed was the cost. 850 degrees Celsius was the barrel temperature when steel began failing. 2025 is when the melted barrel sits in a museum, testament to the moment Soviet gunners fired until physics itself said, "Stop." 6 guns, impossible odds against 380 tanks, 3,247 rounds fired, barrels melted from sustained heat. 87 tanks destroyed, proved that desperation can push equipment beyond all design limits, and that sometimes victory requires destroying your weapons through use. Not because the barrels were designed to fail, because the mission required firing until they did. If this story moved you, Please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of desperate stands that changed battles. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who fired until their weapons died. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.